Imagine a weapon of such destructive power that the very geography of America was too small for it. We have all heard of the Japanese monster, Yamato. The largest, the most powerful, the unsinkable. But what if I told you that the United States designed an answer that surpassed it in every single way? This isn't a story about the Iowa class. This is the story of a ghost. A super battleship that was meant to be the final chord in the era of naval warfare, the Montana class. A ship capable of withstanding a blow that would have destroyed any other fleet in the world. But why did the government press the stop button? What were they afraid of? Was it a mistake by the admirals, or a cold calculation that saved thousands of lives? Today, we open the archives. We will conduct the very duel that was supposed to take place in 1945. And the answer to who would win might shock you. But to understand how America created this monster, we must go back to the day the world first trembled. August 8, 1940. The Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. On this day, the air over the shipyard vibrated with tension, but the world saw nothing. The Japanese command took unprecedented measures. They bought up all the sisal rope supplies in the region to weave giant curtains. They blocked the view from the surrounding hills. They even forbade workers from whispering the word battleship. When the giant hull slid into the water, it displaced so much liquid that a mini tsunami surged through the harbor. This was the Yamato. And at that moment, American intelligence committed one of the most fatal errors in its history. Officers in Washington looked at blurred aerial photos and spy reports, seeing only what they wanted to see. They estimated the new Japanese ship at 35, maybe 45,000 tons. They thought it was armed with 16-inch guns. They were wrong by nearly double. The Yamato weighed 72,000 tons, and its guns had a caliber of 18.1 inches, 46 centimeters. A shell from such a gun weighed as much as a passenger car and could pierce the armor of any existing American ship from 25 kilometers away. America didn't know the exact numbers, but the admirals felt it. A predator had appeared on the horizon that their fleet could not handle. They needed an answer. They needed their own monster. When here, a foe entered the game that could not be defeated by guns: geography. Unlike Japan, which operated mainly in the Pacific, the US Navy had to protect two coasts, the Atlantic and the Pacific. This meant that any American ship was required to pass through the Panama Canal. And this is where the engineering nightmare began. The locks of the Panama Canal are 110 feet wide, roughly 33.5 meters. This bottleneck dictated the design of all American battleships. Engineers were forced to cram their ambitions into these narrow limits. Look at the Iowa class, often called the pinnacle of American shipbuilding. They are magnificent ships, fast, predatory, but they are a compromise. To squeeze powerful engines and guns into a narrow hole that could fit through the Panama Canal, designers had to sacrifice the most important thing: armor. The Iowa had a width of 108 feet. The gap between the steel of the hull and the concrete of the lock was only 30 centimeters on each side. If a sailor stuck his hand out, he would break it against the lock wall. Because of this narrowness, the Iowa could not carry a thick enough armor belt to withstand its own shells, let alone the monstrous shells of the Yamato. In Washington, they realized, if an Iowa met a Yamato in a one-on-one fight, the American ship would likely go to the bottom. The Iowa's speed allowed it to run, but battleships aren't built for fleeing. Battleships are built for dominance. Designers faced an impossible task. They needed to build a ship that carried more armor and more guns than the Iowa, but without becoming wider. The laws of physics said no. If you add weight to a narrow hull, the ship sits deeper, loses stability, and capsizes at the first turn. It seemed like a dead end. The Japanese had won this race before it even started, simply because they didn't have to squeeze through narrow locks in Central America. But in the depths of the Navy's design bureau, a daring plan matured. A plan that required changing not the ship, but the map of the world itself. In 1940, a decision was made in Washington that sounded like science fiction. If the canal prevents us from building the best ships, we will rebuild the canal. Congress approved the Third Locks project. The new chambers were to be 140 feet wide, nearly 43 meters. This was the green light the admirals had been waiting for. The shackles were off. U.S. Navy designers, who for years had struggled to save every kilogram of weight on the Iowa class, suddenly received a blank check. They were told, forget the restrictions. Build us a ship that can go one-on-one with any opponent and come home. Thus, on the drafting boards, Project BB-67 began to take shape. Its name? Montana. Many mistakenly think the Montana was just a larger Iowa. This is fundamentally incorrect. It was a completely different philosophy of war. The Iowa was created as a fast battleship. Her task was to escort aircraft carriers, racing at 33 knots to intercept Japanese cruisers. For this speed, the Iowa sacrificed protection. The Montana, however, was a return to the concept of the standard battleship. She didn't need to run. She didn't need to evade. Her speed was reduced to 28 knots, about 52 kilometers per hour. Slow by cruiser standards, but enough to hold the line. All the freed up mass went into muscle, into steel, into guns. Imagine the scale. The length, 280 meters. That's nearly 3 football fields. But the main thing was the width. The whole width of the Montana grew to 37 meters. That is 4 meters wider than the Iowa. Doesn't seem like much? In shipbuilding, it's an abyss. These extra meters gave the ship incredible stability. Now she could carry guns whose recoil would have capsized the narrow Iowa. The full load displacement was planned at around 71,000 tons. For comparison, the legendary Titanic weighed about 52,000. The Montana was heavier than the Titanic, yet she was packed with explosives, fuel, and armor, not crystal and passengers. This was a monster born of American industrial might at its peak. 5 hulls were ordered. 5 Leviathans: Montana, Ohio, Maine, New Hampshire, and Louisiana. If this fleet had put to sea, no power in the world could have fielded an adequate response. Not even the Yamato. Because when the engineers were freed from the Panama Canal, they did something they had never done before. They designed a ship that could survive its own blow. They created what is known in naval terms as the immunity zone. And believe me, these figures will astound you. When it comes to battleship armor, most people imagine just a very thick steel wall. But for naval engineers, protection is a complex mathematical equation called the zone of immunity. The logic is simple. If an enemy battleship gets too close, its shells will fly on a flat trajectory and pierce your side through sheer kinetic energy. If it moves too far away, the shells will fall almost vertically, piercing the decks and exploding in the powder magazines. Between these two deadly distances, there is a golden mean where a shell pierces neither the side nor the deck. This is the immunity zone. The Iowa class, which the US is so proud of, had a dirty secret. Their immunity zone was calculated against outdated 16-inch guns weighing 1 ton. But against their own modern super-heavy shells weighing over 1,200 kilograms, the Iowa was practically defenseless. Against the Yamato and its 46-centimeter monsters, the Iowa had no safe zone at all. At any distance, a Japanese shell would either stitch her right through or blow her boilers apart through the deck. The Montana was meant to fix this fatal flaw. Engineers returned to a classic armor scheme. On the Iowa, the armor belt was hidden inside the hull to improve streamlining. On the Montana, the belt was moved outside. It was a return to brute force. The main armor belt was 409 millimeters thick, 16.1 inches. It was sloped at an angle of 19 degrees, which effectively increased the thickness of metal a shell had to penetrate to nearly half a meter. But it wasn't just about millimeters. It was about metallurgy. American Class A cemented armor was considered the best in the world in terms of the strength-to-toughness ratio. The Japanese steel on the Yamato was thicker, 410 millimeters, but it was more brittle and contained more impurities. American tests showed that a 16-inch US plate held up better than an 18-inch plate of the older type. The Montana was designed to withstand hits from its own super-heavy shells at ranges from 16 to 28 kilometers. This meant a Montana captain could dictate the terms of the battle. He could close to a distance where his guns tore the enemy apart, while the enemy shells simply bounced off his armor like pebbles off a wall. The protection was total. 3 armored decks with a total thickness of up to 250 millimeters were designed to stop aerial bombs and plunging shells. The underwater protection, anti-torpedo bulges, went over 6 meters deep into the hull. It was a layer cake of steel, liquid, and air, capable of absorbing the blast of a warhead weighing 340 kilograms of TNT. Effectively, the Montana would have been the most protected ship ever designed in the United States. A floating bunker. Many wonder, why did the Americans, knowing about the Japanese 18-inch guns, not put something similar on the Montana? Why did they stay loyal to the 16-inch caliber? The answer lies not in the size of the muzzle, but in what comes out of it. The main battery of the Montana consisted of 12 Mark 7 50 caliber guns. These were the exact same guns used on the Iowa. But the difference was in the quantity. The Iowa carried 9 barrels in 3 turrets. The Montana received a 4th turret at the stern. This increased firepower by 33% in one stroke. American engineers bet on the Mark 8 Super Heavy shell. It was a technological masterpiece. At the same caliber, it was significantly longer and heavier than the standard shells of other nations. It weighed 1,225 kilograms. In the fleet, they were called flying Volkswagens. The secret of the Mark 8 was its ballistics. It fell on the target at a steeper angle than Japanese shells. This allowed it to penetrate deck armor, reaching the very heart of the enemy ship, the boilers and magazines. Let's do the math. The full broadside of a Yamato, 9 shells at 1,460 kilograms each, weighed about 13 tons. The broadside of a Montana, 12 shells at 1,225 kilograms each, weighed nearly 15 tons. Think about that. The Montana threw 2 tons more of deadly metal at the enemy every 30 seconds. This isn't just superiority. This is suppression. Furthermore, 12 guns gave the Montana a tactical advantage called density of fire. In a naval battle, especially at long ranges, you rarely hit with the first shot. You create a dispersion ellipse, the zone where the shells fall. With the Yamato's 9 guns, this ellipse was quite sparse. With the Montana's 12 guns, the chances of straddling the target increased geometrically. It's the difference between a sniper rifle shot and a blast from a shotgun. But the Montana was dangerous not just to battleships. The Americans took the lessons of the early war years and completely redesigned the secondary battery. Instead of the old 5-inch 38 caliber guns, the Montana was to receive new, powerful 5-inch 54 caliber guns. They fired further, faster, and more accurately. 20 such guns created an impenetrable wall of fire around the battleship, capable of shredding destroyers and light cruisers before they even got close. Let's transport ourselves to an alternate 1945. A stormy night in the Philippine Sea. Visibility, less than 10 kilometers. Waves hide the horizon. This is where, in the darkness, 2 titans meet, Yamato and Montana. This is a scenario historians have debated for 80 years. On paper, the Yamato has the advantage in range. Its guns hit at 42 kilometers, compared to 38 for the Montana. Japanese optics are legendary. Their 15-meter rangefinders are the best glass eyes in the world. But in this equation, there is a variable that changes everything: darkness. In 1945, the American fleet no longer fought with eyes. The Montana would have been equipped with the latest Mark 8 fire control radar. This radar didn't just see the target. It showed the splashes of its own shells on the screen, allowing for fire correction without visual contact. The battle begins at a range of 30 kilometers. The Yamato is blind. Its observers strain their eyes, trying to find the enemy's silhouette in the gloom. But on the Montana's bridge, the target lock signal is already sounding. The ship's electronic brain has calculated the enemy's course and speed. The Montana opens fire first. 12 guns belch flame. The shells are in flight for over a minute. Imagine that time. 60 seconds of silence as 1.5 tons of death flies through the stratosphere. The Montana's first salvo lands in a straddle, a short and an over. The Mark 8 radar instantly records the splashes. The operator enters a correction. Second salvo, a hit. The Yamato finally sees the flashes of gunfire on the horizon and responds. Its 18-inch guns roar, shaking the ship itself. But the Japanese have to aim at the flashes, which at this distance is equivalent to shooting in the dark. Now the mathematics of the kill begins. American super heavy shells fall on the Yamato's deck almost vertically. The Japanese deck armor is 200 millimeters. The Montana's shell pierces it, bursting into the inner compartments. The Yamato had a structural weakness, the joint between the upper and lower armor belts. A hit in this zone causes uncontrollable flooding, but the Yamato is a tough nut to crack. Suppose a stray Japanese shell hits the Montana. 460 millimeters of steel and explosives strike the side. The American armor holds, but the force of the blow knocks out radar settings, severs communications, and concusses the crew. However, the Citadel is intact. The engines are running. The key factor here is tempo and accuracy. In the conditions of a real battle, surrounded by explosions, smoke, and chaos, optical rangefinders lose their effectiveness. Lenses fog up. Vibration ruins the settings. Radar, however, feels no fear or fatigue. With every new salvo, the Montana's advantage grows. 12 barrels against 9 create a fire density 30% higher. U.S. Navy statistics by the end of the war showed that the effectiveness of radar fire was several times higher than optical fire. After 20 minutes of combat, the Yamato is turned into burning ruins. Its superstructures are destroyed by high explosive shells, its guidance systems annihilated. It is still afloat, but it can no longer fight. The Montana, having received several terrible scars, continues to methodically shell the giant from the darkness, remaining almost invisible. Computer simulations and naval war games repeatedly show the same result. In 7 out of 10 cases, the Montana wins. Not because she is larger, but because in 1945, technology defeated brute force. Radar killed the samurai. While engineers were drawing the armor belt lines for the Montana, and metallurgists were casting samples of super-strength steel, something was happening in the Pacific that made all this work meaningless. History played a cruel joke on the battleships. The Montana was preparing for the war of the past, but the war of the future had already arrived. December 7, 1941 was the first wake-up call. Pearl Harbor showed that aviation could sink a battleship at its moorings. But admirals are conservative people. Many in Washington still believed that in the open sea, at full speed, a battleship could fight off planes and force a gun duel. The belief in the decisive battle was strong. The Montana was still given the green light. But then came May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was the first naval engagement in human history where the opposing ships never saw each other. Not a single main battery shell was fired at an enemy hull. The entire battle was fought by air groups that took off from carrier decks, flew 200 miles, dropped bombs, and returned. For supporters of the Montana, this was a cold shower. Why do you need armor designed to withstand a shell from 20 kilometers if the enemy attacks you from 300? Why do you need 12 powerful guns if you can't even see who to shoot at? In this new war, the zone of immunity simply ceased to exist. A dive bomber's bomb fell vertically from the heavens, ignoring your side armor calculations. And then came Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial fleet, were destroyed in a single day. And it wasn't battleships that did it, but squadrons of dauntless dive bombers. At that moment, a tectonic shift occurred in the halls of the U.S. Navy. The aircraft carrier officially became the new queen of the board. The battleship was dethroned. From the main strike force, it turned into a support unit. And here, the fatal flaw of the Montana appeared, which we mentioned at the very beginning. Speed. The new fleet tactics were built around fast carrier task forces. Essex-class carriers raced across the ocean at 33 knots. Iowa-class battleships could keep up with them. They also hit 33 knots. They became the perfect bodyguards, creating a wall of anti-aircraft fire around the precious carriers. But the Montana? Her maximum speed was 28 knots. In the world of the new war, she was simply too slow. She would have become an anchor, dragging down the entire task force. To leave her alone without air cover? That would be suicide, as the fates of the German Bismarck and the Japanese Yamato showed. To drag her along? That would deprive the fleet of maneuverability. The greatest battleship, designed for dominance, was suddenly unneeded. She was too fat to run with the carriers, and too expensive to be used just for shore bombardment. The resource problem arose. Building one Montana-class ship required as much steel as building two Essex-class heavy carriers, or dozens of destroyers, or thousands of Sherman tanks. In a total war, steel is the lifeblood of the economy. President Roosevelt and Admiral King looked at the numbers. The choice was brutal, but logical. Why build 5 giant dinosaurs that would likely never see an enemy battleship, if you could build 10 aircraft carriers that would win the war in 6 months? On July 21, 1943, the order was signed. The construction of the Montana class was canceled. The slipways reserved for these monsters were given over to carriers and landing ships. July 21, 1943. This date became the official epitaph for the age of super-battleships. The order to cancel the construction of the 5 Montana-class hulls was final. No mothballing, no saving for better times. The program was shut down, the blueprints rolled up, and the engineers reassigned to projects for landing ships and escort carriers. But in shipbuilding, nothing disappears without a trace. By the time of the cancellation, the U.S. industrial machine was in high gear. Tens of thousands of tons of armor steel had been ordered. Some keel elements were already finished. Where did all this wealth go? The answer lies on the surface, and many of you have seen it with your own eyes without even realizing it. The legacy of the Montana was embodied in the Midway-class aircraft carriers. The USS Midway, the lead ship of the new series, was designed with the same philosophy as the Montana. Forget the Panama Canal. It was the first American carrier with an armored flight deck capable of withstanding kamikaze strikes. To carry this heavy armor, the hull required immense width and stability. Engineers used the hydrodynamic data from the Montana's hull. The anti-torpedo protection system, the Citadel armor scheme, all of it migrated from the canceled battleship to the new carrier. The steel that was supposed to protect gunners from Yamato shells now protected pilots from bombs. The Midway served in the fleet for nearly 50 years, participated in Vietnam, and even in Operation Desert Storm. So, in a way, the spirit of the Montana did get to fight. But there is another side to the coin, the what if. Let's imagine for a moment that at least 2 hulls, Montana and Ohio, had been completed. How would their fate have unfolded in the Cold War? Naval historians agree, the Montana would have been a far more valuable asset in the 1980s than the Iowa-class battleships. When the Iowas were reactivated and equipped with Tomahawk missiles under Reagan, engineers faced a problem. The Iowa is a very wet ship. Its narrow bow buries itself in waves, soaking the deck and sensitive electronics. Furthermore, the Iowa's hull vibrated so violently at high speeds that it broke radars. There was catastrophically little room inside for modern vertical launch systems. The Montana was free of all these flaws. Her wide hull was a stable platform, ideal for missiles. The massive internal volumes would have allowed for hundreds of Tomahawks and the most powerful Aegis radars, turning the battleship into an unsinkable arsenal ship. If the Montanas had been built, they would likely still be in service today, serving as floating command centers and platforms for 21st century hypersonic weapons. Their margin of safety and modernization potential were boundless. But history knows no subjunctive mood. 5 of America's greatest ships exist only as beautiful museum models and digital assets in video games. The hulls never touched the water. Their metal was melted down for civilian needs or diverted to other military projects. The greatest duel in history, Montana versus Yamato, remained a hypothesis, a debate in officer clubs and on internet forums. We never saw this fight, and perhaps that is for the best, because the price of testing this theory would have been measured in thousands of lives. When you look at photos of modern destroyers or aircraft carriers today, they seem efficient, technological, almost sterile. They lack that primal power that radiated from the battleships. Battleships were something more than just combat units. They were the steel cathedrals of the industrial age, monuments to a time when a nation's greatness was measured in calibers and millimeters of armor. The Montana class was meant to be the crown of this evolution, the absolute predator, a ship in which every drawing, every rivet was brought to perfection. It was the pinnacle of American engineering of the 1940s. The irony is that the Montana died not from an enemy shell, but from its own superiority. She was so powerful and expensive that the world around her changed faster than she could be built. The story of the Montana is a reminder that in great conflicts, it is not the strongest who wins, but the most adaptable. While the admirals dreamed of titanic duels on the horizon, the sky over the ocean filled with the hum of hundreds of engines. War became three-dimensional, fast, and merciless to giants. But why are we still so fascinated by this ship? Why do thousands of people study its blueprints, build models, and argue over its armor? Perhaps because the Montana embodies our drive for the limit of the possible. She is a symbol of an era when man believed he could build something absolutely indestructible. If you are ever in Norfolk or Los Angeles and step onto the deck of an Iowa or a Missouri, pause for a moment. Look at those enormous turrets. And then imagine a ship even larger, even heavier. A ship that could take the hit of the heaviest shell in the world and keep on fighting. The Montana remained on paper, but she lives in our imagination as the greatest ghost of the ocean. She is a reminder that even the most perfect weapons can arrive too late, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon in history is the one that never fired a single shot. We will never know for sure how that battle in the Philippine Sea would have turned out. But perhaps that is the Montana's ultimate victory. She remained undefeated. She remained perfect. By staying in the shadow of the archives, she kept her legend pure, untainted by the bitterness of defeat or the rust of oblivion. This concluded the story of the battleships, but the echo of their salvos still rings through history. And somewhere out there, in the infinite ocean of hypotheses, the Montana is still on her course, ready to meet any enemy. Thank you for watching until this point. Naval history is full of such forgotten giants, and if you're interested in learning about other projects that could have changed the world, let us know in the comments. Until the next deep dive.